So we're joined with Lucy O'Keefe today. It'd be great if you could give yourself a bit of an introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Lucy O'Keefe. I'm the CEO and co-founder of CroíValve. So CroíValve is a medical device company that has developed a device to repair the valve in the tricuspid valve without the need for open heart surgery. So yeah, so very much focused on kind of treat patients with valve issues, heart failure. And yeah, we're predominantly based in Ireland, but have a team in the US as well.
Amazing. And how did you get into the structural heart space then? Because you've got quite a unique background, been across different industries. It'd be good to understand how you ended up where you are.
Sure. So I'm an engineer by training. I have a degree in mechanical engineering and a PhD in biomedical engineering. And after that, I went into industry and I went into Medtronic, where I got really great experience. And within that window, actually, Medtronic started getting involved in structural heart. So they acquired a couple of aortic stenosis, or companies treating aortic stenosis. And I was heavily involved in integrating one of those companies into Medtronic. So yeah, I got kind of very good exposure to what's involved in developing a heart valve. And then I left Medtronic and kind of went on to do other device development programs. And then I kind of reconnected with an individual who I would have met during my PhD. He's a lecturer in Trinity College here in Dublin. And he'd kind of partnered up with a cardiologist, and they had a concept for treating the tricuspid valve. They had got some funding to do some kind of research within the university from Enterprise Ireland, and they were looking for people to join the team. And the timing just sort of happened to suit a point in my career where I was looking for a change. And so, yeah, I kind of took the leap without having any idea of what I was taking on, but don't regret it.
Well, you took the leap for a reason. So what do you think that was? What was the most exciting part of it that thought, I'm going to dedicate a good chunk of my life towards this?
Yeah, for me, it's like, kind of throughout my career, I've been involved in kind of leading device development projects. And I love that kind of journey of kind of seeing a device go through that journey and ideally getting it, into a place where you're treating patients. But one of the key things for me was to make sure you're involved in a project that has kind of good foundations and that the value proposition makes sense, because otherwise, no matter how good you are at executing a project, if it's not built in good foundations, you'll struggle for you to really have the impact you want. So at that point, I was looking to get involved in something earlier in the journey, because when you're in sort of large companies, which, I've had great experience in large companies, but you tend to get involved in projects when the decision to execute the project has already been made. And so you don't really get to kind of influence that kind of decision-making process and really getting to understand the value proposition. So for me, it was about getting involved earlier in the journey. I probably would have historically thought I was, a bit too risk adverse for the kind of startup world. I'm not, I don't think I'm the sort of stereotypical entrepreneur who's gonna, bet their house on the idea. But for me, it was about very much the getting involved in a project you believed in and something that you could really see the impact of your contribution.
Okay, and how far into the CroíValve project was they when you joined it? So it was founded in 2016, right?
Yeah, so I joined very much at the start. Martin, who's my co-founder, who's the cardiologist who came up with the idea, he had patented the idea. So he had very much, that was, the concept was there, and he had met Bruce and they had got funding from Enterprise Ireland. But at that stage, both of them kind of had full-time jobs. So they were looking to get some people involved who were able to kind of dedicate time to it full-time and also had experience. So two of us joined that team in 2016. To kind of run a project within Trinity for 2 years. So it was before sort of the company was formed. It started as a research project, not really with any of us kind of defining what role we were going to do afterwards or the full journey of the company. I was pretty naive, I guess, at that stage to what was involved. In the startup journey, I obviously knew how to develop a heart valve. So we joined, both two of us joined in 2016 to kind of do that early research, with obviously Bruce and Martin then supporting as well.
Amazing. So what's a high level overview of what CroíValve are trying to solve?
So basically in elderly patients, things start going wrong with their heart. So typically who we're treating are patients over 65, and different things start going wrong with their heart. So the valves in their heart stop functioning correctly, and therefore blood flows back in the wrong direction. And the disease we're treating is called tricuspid regurgitation. It typically happens in conjunction with other things going wrong in the heart. So whether one of the other valves stops working, or they have atrial fibrillation, conduction disturbances, high blood pressure. And so ultimately what happens is the tricuspid valve is the valve between the chambers in the right side of your heart. And as the disease progresses, the leaflets of the valve separate and blood leaks back in the wrong direction. And it results in challenging symptoms for patients. They end up kind of retaining a lot of fluid. So the fluid kind of compresses their lungs. They find it difficult to breathe. They retain fluid in their legs, so they kind of have swollen legs. And so, yeah, it drives a lot of additional symptoms. They also are difficult to treat for other diseases. So very focused on kind of, trying to treat a mechanical issue in terms of stop blood flowing back in the wrong direction. But obviously when you're dealing with the heart, then there's a whole environment that you need to maybe accommodate.
And just how many people does this disease affect?
So, there was a recent study actually presented by David Cohen at TCT last year that really looked at the prevalence of this disease. It probably hasn't been understood, fully. And the prevalence is 3.6% of the population over 65. So as I say, while the odd person maybe gets a disease under 65, they can usually be treated with surgery. We're dealing with patients who are too sick for surgery. And so 3.6% of the population over 65 have moderate or greater tricuspid regurgitation. Not all of those necessarily need treatment because they aren't fully symptomatic, but at least a quarter of those. So there's 500,000 people every year in Europe and the US developing this disease.
Wow. And what happens if this gets left untreated?
So the disease self-propagates actually. So if you get a little bit of blood leaking in the wrong direction, the heart tries to work harder to compensate. And in working harder, it pulls the leaflets apart. So actually the disease typically continues to progress if not treated. And so the patient's symptoms get worse and worse. So that's one of the challenges, that the disease sort of continues to advance unless you try and ultimately deal with the source.
Okay. And what's the current standard of care like in the space for this area?
So historically, the standard of care was medication. So as I mentioned, the patients are typically too elderly and frail for surgery. So, about 1% to 2% of patients would have historically had open heart surgery. And so they would have been managed with diuretics, where that would sort of reduce that fluid retention, but not treat the valve. Recently, obviously, the treatment of heart valves has undergone, a revolution in the last sort of 20, 25 years, moving from open heart surgery to transcatheter treatment or minimally invasive treatment, starting with the aortic valve, moving to the mitral valve. And now certainly there's a huge amount of activity in the tricuspid valve. So over the last number of years, the first kind of transcatheter devices have been approved commercially in Europe and the US. So there's 2 devices recently approved in the US and a few more, but mainly two devices kind of being used in Europe. So now the standard of care is evolving to patients getting minimally invasive treatment, but there's still a lot of patients who anatomically aren't suitable to those commercial devices, and also those commercial devices can have variable outcomes.
Okay. And, as CroíValve develops and grows as a business, where do you ideally want to be in terms of this treatment? What would you ideally want to see in the next few years to say, we made it?
Yeah, for us, it's all about clinical validation. This very much comes back to the patient and us trying to prove that we are providing a solution that is what is needed for the patient. And so there's a couple of key pillars to that. We're looking to be able to provide a solution that can treat the broadest range of patients possible. These patients, the disease drives changes in the anatomy. And so these patients typically have huge variability in their anatomy. And so developing a device that can cope with that variability can be very challenging. So that's been a key part of what we're trying to achieve, and has been maybe a challenge for other devices. So we want to make sure we can treat the broadest amount of patients. We want to make sure that our outcomes in terms of safety and efficacy are the best they can be and absolutely meet the needs of the patient. And then also we want to make sure that we have a procedure that is, consistent, repeatable, straightforward to do, because you want this to be something that can scale easily into the cath labs. So for us, maybe to answer the question you asked in terms of near term, it's about clinical validation to prove our device does that. And as is always the case with these kind of devices, you get learnings in the clinic that you have to respond to. We've been running clinical studies since 2022, and so kind of have gone through already a pretty active journey on that. And we've recently introduced some pretty exciting device updates. And so for us, it's about now proving out that those updates perform in patients as we expect, and see the improvements that we want in patients.
Amazing. And those improvements, is it the actual procedure improvements or how earlier they can be treated? What's the gold standard that you want to achieve?
So, I mean, ultimately, you're trying to make sure you do the best job of reducing the blood leaking backwards. So it's about making sure that we can achieve that in the full spectrum of patients, making sure we can achieve that without, having any unintended adverse events, and making sure we can achieve that with a procedure that's predictable, and making sure we can kind of treat the broadest range of patients that we kind of see through our through our sites. So yeah.
Okay. And so this area used to be called the forgotten valve. It's not that anymore. Why was it such a difficult area to innovate in and treat?
So I think there's maybe two reasons why it was maybe the forgotten valve. One is, there's valves that are on the left side of your heart that pump most of the blood to your body. And so you do always need to treat those valves. They would always probably be seen clinically as the higher priority. So they got the attention first. And historically, the belief was that if you treated the mitral valve or the aortic valve, then the tricuspid valve might just fix itself. But I guess we've learned that as we've had new therapies to treat the mitral valve, that doesn't always happen. So part of it was, I think, clinically, it always made sense to start treating the valves on the left side. And then additionally to that, I think the tricuspid, there's lots of reasons why the tricuspid valve is also very challenging. I mentioned that the anatomy changes with the disease, and so you end up with a very different kind of size valve and a very different anatomical challenge as to what you would have. And so I think that's proven. There's a lot of therapies that have originally been designed to treat the mitral valve and now have been repurposed to try and treat the tricuspid valve because there is similarities, but I think they don't always, because they weren't originally designed for the tricuspid valve, they struggle with maybe some of the unique challenges that are there with the tricuspid valve.
So it sounds like one of the biggest misconceptions was actually how important that valve was. And what do you think sparked that change that so many companies now are trying to race to get products to that market?
I mean, I think it's a combination of as we've been able to treat more patients with mitral regurgitation, we've been able to see that, okay, even if you do that, the patients still have symptoms related to their tricuspid regurgitation. So I think, it's that the overall field of transcatheter heart valves has evolved. And then, it's also kind of an investment from the clinical community in understanding the data that we have from these patients, and understanding, doing kind of rigorous scientific research to see whether, if you compare a patient with and without tricuspid regurgitation, but equivalent baseline characteristics, with respect to other parameters, what is the difference in outcomes? So, I think it's just a combination of, the kind of field evolving and then, the focus of the clinical community trying to generate, valuable data.
Amazing. And so where does CroíValve sit in that treatment landscape? Because I believe it's a lot of people are trying to clip it, or a lot of people are trying to replace the valves. Where do you guys sit?
Yeah, we have, a unique technology that probably sits a little bit between repair and replacement. So we are very much looking to work with what's there. And this comes back to kind of my co-founder, Martin's kind of philosophy as a physician, maybe about kind of to preserve the innate anatomy. So we are, strictly speaking, I suppose, trying to repair the defect and still use the native leaflets. And a key part of our kind of thought process is to try and preserve the right heart function. So we deliberately try and avoid contact with the right heart and disrupting the right heart function. So from that approach, we're sort of a repair technology, but we also actually have a prosthetic valve in our device. So we're sort of sitting halfway between, I guess, repair and replacement, and truthfully developing what we would see as a new category that we kind of call adaptive co-optation. So there is lots of different ways of treating the tricuspid valve, and lots of them have good thought behind them. And I suppose, we have our own view now about, a new approach to innovating a better way to treat the tricuspid valve.
Amazing. And out of those other two categories, which one do you think's been getting more of this right in terms of replacement or?
I think they both get things right, and then they both have limitations. So, and if you if you engage with the clinical community, I think there is mixed perspectives about what's the right approach. So I don't think there's any one solution that everyone agrees is the best approach. I think the clip technology has a very long clinical history and has a very safe profile, but is a challenging procedure and does struggle with dealing with the full spectrum of anatomy and sort of co-optation defect that you see in these patients. And then, replacement technologies obviously do a very good job of eliminating TR, but because they do contact the right heart, there is potentially other impacts around that because there's structures in the right heart that can be disrupted by that. So both have both of those commercial devices, have challenges around the procedure in terms of ease of use and challenging imaging requirements. So both have, obviously got lots of advantages, and that's why they are being embraced by the clinical community. And it's great to see that, and to see that there is an engagement from the clinical community in trying to treat these patients, and those two technologies have done a lot in terms of starting that journey. But certainly a lot of opportunity in terms of both patients not suitable for treatment, and also opportunity to maybe make the procedure a little bit more scalable.
Amazing. And what's the clinicians' feedback been to where you guys sit in between both?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this, the key, I suppose, pieces that I think physicians really, really like about our technology is the fact that, yes, we do kind of preserve right heart function. So, I suppose lots of physicians see the benefit in that. The right ventricle is effectively the pump function that kind of, moves the blood around. And so allowing that normal mechanism to continue to operate, I think has benefits. And then certainly this straightforward procedure. I mean, I think physicians want to be able to do a procedure that they know going into it what the outcomes are going to be, and they don't want to, have that be variable and sort of, that they can't predict. So I think those are the pieces that they really appreciate, I guess, in terms of what we have to offer. And as well, obviously, being able to treat patients that other devices can't. Physicians are obviously looking to treat as many patients as possible. They're the ones sitting in front of the patients needing to provide a solution. So, yeah, we would certainly, within the trial we're running now, get a lot of patients who are not suitable for treatment from other devices. And so physicians are delighted that we're providing them an option where they can potentially treat the patient.
Amazing. And I think where lots online as well, it's typically a faster procedure as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I don't think, ultimately, I think yes, fast is probably helpful in terms of planning cath labs. It is faster, in terms of if you look at the learning curve. But I think it's that predictability, probably that's the most important thing. I think, that physicians kind of understand what they're going to get, because I suppose, if they're sitting in front of a patient saying they believe this is the right thing to do, they want to have confidence that the outcomes are going to be as they expect.
Okay, fantastic. And so whereabouts are you guys at today as a business?
Yeah, so we're a team of about, I think, probably close to 45 people now. Our R&D and operations are based in Ireland, mostly in Dublin, but we have a group in Galway as well now to sort of leverage the skill set that's there in the west of Ireland. And then our ClinReg are predominantly in the US. We're running a trial that is predominantly in the US, but we also have kind of kept a couple of the sites in Poland that would have been with us in our early clinical study. So very focused on clinical validation. As I've mentioned, we've just implemented a couple of updates to our device that are pretty exciting. And so, it's great now to be able to kind of roll those out to the clinic.
Amazing. And what was those early European data like? Was it good?
Yeah, lots of really positive signals from that data. So, we focus on obviously being able to reduce the regurgitation, improve patient symptoms. We, saw pretty significant improvement in patient symptoms, both in, measures back from the patients and in kind of physician read outcomes. And we've patients out beyond 2 years now of follow-up and still see sustained good outcomes. And then, as you mentioned, we have kind of short procedural times, and we prove the ability to be able to treat some of these more challenging anatomical features that maybe other devices struggle with. So very encouraging. As with all kind of structural heart technologies, you have some learnings about how to best match the device to patients. And so those have been our key learnings. Thankfully, nothing kind of fundamental in terms of the technology. And so that's what we've been focused on, optimizing since we started our clinical work, and now have rolled those back in into the trial.
I want to take a minute to say thank you to our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical device development. With deep scientific and engineering expertise, they help medtech teams crack tough development challenges and make the right calls early, reducing rework, delays, and uncertainty later on. Whether you're navigating uncharted technical territory or racing towards market, TTP brings clarity and real-world judgment to the decisions that shape performance, usability, and manufacturability. By retiring risk early and grounding innovation in real-world constraints, they help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
Something that I did want to ask you about directly, you've had exposure to it, is I see a lot of startups in the medtech space in Ireland. Why is it an attractive place for companies to start?
I mean, I think it probably stems from the fact that there is quite a lot of, multinationals from medical devices based here. And so that certainly kind of builds a foundation of skill set. I would have worked in Medtronic for a good number of years, and I got a really great training there, both in heart valves, but also in, design controls, the processes needed to develop a medical device. And so, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, there's lots of Edwards, all of the large companies in our space actually have presence in Ireland. And so I suppose then there is the ability, I guess, for people to sort of learn their trade a little bit in that environment and then use that and apply it to the startup ecosystem. So I think that's an important part. I mean, I think heart valves aren't something necessarily we've lots of great engineers who join us out of college, but you do need, people in the business who kind of have gone through that journey and understand it and experience. And so we certainly benefited from, people coming out of multinationals having had that experience. And then the other piece to call out, I guess, is Enterprise Ireland, I think, are great at supporting startups in this ecosystem. I mentioned, the original grant funding we had would have come from that source. Medical devices aren't the type of technology you can bootstrap. You do need some capital at the start. And, it's difficult to raise any venture capital before you have some data. So I think that kind of model of Enterprise Ireland providing kind of grant funding into university research projects allow you do that. And certainly that's a relatively tried and tested model. And now, in Ireland, there is a great ecosystem of both multinationals and startups. And it's a really collaborative environment. It's a really great ecosystem where we all help ourselves. There's a conference here this week where we'll all catch up and trade notes. And then I would say there's also kind of individuals who have kind of been on that journey a couple of times. Our chairman, Bernard Collins, would have been heavily involved. He would have been heavily involved in Boston Scientific originally in Ireland, but then also got involved in some of the very successful startups in Ireland that have kind of grown beyond startups like Craigana and Aerogen. And so there's a number of individuals like that are very active in the ecosystem. And certainly, he's been a big part of mentoring me on my journey in terms of, someone who's been there, done that, and can help guide you. So I think there's just lots of great elements to it's a tough journey. So lots of great elements to kind of set you up somewhat on the right path.
Yeah, it looks like they all compound. You're right, there's so many good companies here as well, so you won't be short of talent, and it's a relatively small geography as well, so they should be nearby, which will be very helpful. I wanted to touch on something that you talked about, and it was obviously fundraising. How much have you raised so far, and how have you found the fundraising on that journey?
Yeah, we've raised, I think, about 40 million in equity and about a little over 15 in grant financing. So I think we're getting close to about 60 million now. Fundraising is always challenging. I'm not sure anyone will sit here and say fundraising is straightforward. And particularly, I think, as a first-time founder, you don't have a track record of having sold a business, which obviously would provide more confidence to investors. So always challenging. But, we've actually been very successful in raising capital in Ireland for a technology that is expensive in terms of, heart valves are not one of the cheaper ends of medical device development, both in terms of the clinical validation required and ultimately, the technology development. And we've got a huge amount of support from early stage Irish investors, both kind of venture and angels. And continue to be surprised by the level of support we get. As you mentioned, it's a small ecosystem. So I think that can work for you and against you. And thankfully for us, where we've sort of delivered on what we set out to do, then, that kind of works in your favor, where people kind of build that trust in that and then continue to support you. And then we would also have UK and US investors as well. So I mean, it's a constant journey in terms of making sure you can fund the business. And, I would say Ireland still probably doesn't have the level of access to capital that would be seen in the US. So there certainly are challenges. But we've managed to navigate our way so far.
Good. And I know people say that they're always fundraising. There's never a bad time to be doing it. Are you actively raising right now?
So no, we're not sort of targeting a significant raise right now, but certainly, I mean, there's a conference this week where there's, lots of investors coming to Dublin. So you'd certainly sit down, let them know, the progress you've made, your fundraising plans, because, this is a long journey. And so, typically we, investors would plan out their sort of kind of pipeline. And so it's always good to make sure they know where you are, and, the type of capital that we need to raise for the journey ahead is significant. And so that's not going to be done in one meeting. So so it's very much about building relationships. So we would be continuing to focus on that and engaging investors as part of that, but don't have a specific, raise that we're looking to close this year.
Okay. One question I love to ask people, you're at a stage now where it's very exciting. You've grown quite significantly over the years. What's the biggest hardships that you've faced as an early founder?
I mean, I think with our type of technology, there's always going to be learnings in the clinic, and, they're pretty challenging, because I think you can get, 95% of things right, and one thing, not that you don't get it right, let's say, but it's a learning that you didn't expect. And so I think, that kind of scenario forces you to have to sort of, reconfigure all of your plans, everything that you had a plan. And so that piece can be, challenging to navigate the team through, because you need to kind of make sure you quickly readjust your plans and everyone understands what that means and what they need to do. So I think we have a great team who've learned how to do that now. And I think if you talk to any startup journey, it's not, it can look possibly from LinkedIn like it's been a very linear and straightforward trajectory, but mostly there's reasonable heavy lifting in scenarios in the background. And ultimately, the test is about how the team perform in those scenarios. And so we have a great team who have, responded excellently to that, but it's never fun at the time. So I think that's the piece that, the predictability of it, you have to be prepared for things to change, and you have to be able to be comfortable with then replanning with, as much information as you have, and working out the rest of the plans as you get more information. So that isn't for everybody, I guess, in terms of the level of change that you need to be comfortable with. And also it's a huge commitment. I mean, you don't get to sort of, turn around and say, well, that's beyond what is reasonable for a job to ask. You sort of have to just do what's needed.
Amazing. And so you talked about you've made some new changes to products. How far along are you in the clinical development right now?
So we've rolled those changes back into the clinic, and they're, we've treated a small number of patients so far, and it's looking really positive. So very much now focused on kind of validating those changes, and very focused now on kind of commercialization planning. So understanding kind of the clinical data set that will be needed both for FDA approval and CE mark approval. I think a lot of medical device companies are possibly giving up on CE mark approval, but we still are looking to try and understand the journey for both. Certainly the US is the most significant market and always takes priority, but we believe there is value in CE marking, and certainly looking to go after both opportunities.
And did you start out primarily just thinking about the US, or was you always going to go for the dual channel approach there?
Good question. I mean, certainly we have always prioritized the US. So certainly I don't think you could, I think, a Europe only strategy might be a challenging one, I think, to pursue. But so, I mean, I don't know whether we always planned both. We certainly always planned the US as the priority, but we've been going through our journey as MDR has rolled out. So it was harder to predict exactly what was required in Europe. But as time has evolved, we've certainly always tried to not forget about it, and certainly now have a very active strategy around it. Yeah.
Amazing. And what are the key milestones over the next 12 months then?
So clinical validation. So yeah, I mean, the key milestones are clinical validation in terms of proving out those device changes. And then, yeah, we have some engagement with the regulators, both in Europe and the US, in terms of kind of finalizing what's needed for that commercialization pathway. So those are the key things, yeah.
Amazing. So your first trial in Europe, I'm guessing, was 10 to 20 patients, normally quite early. How big is the second trial that's been going on?
Yeah, so we're ultimately looking to kind of expand this study and probably treat up to kind of 80 patients. So a reasonably decent sized study. With this kind of technology, I think there is a real advantage of understanding how the technology performs, and also, the patient population is hugely diverse. So you do need to kind of treat a reasonably broad number of patients to make sure you kind of understand that diversity. Yeah.
Okay. And what do you think is the single biggest risk of CroíValve's success over the next 5 years?
I probably don't know whether I'll go to single biggest. I mean, with this kind of technology, there's always clinical risks. So, we certainly, I feel, have significantly de-risked that from a clinical perspective. I'm not sure I totally appreciated the level of clinical risk that you have starting a first in human in this space at the time, but it's significant. And so I think we've gone through a great journey of significantly de-risking that. But until you've treated 100 patients, 500 patients, you still haven't finished that. So, there's definitely still some clinical risk. It's a capital intensive journey. So I think there always is risk in terms of raising capital. Medical device development journeys have taken longer, so it doesn't perfectly fit the venture model of the 5-year return. There's more buyers in biotech, so they sometimes get more funds. And then AI obviously is the, piece that's taking all of the available venture. So venture capital. So capital raising is always a risk. And then, yeah, obviously, the reason we're very focused on, commercialization planning is to make sure we can provide kind of certainty around what's needed to get to market. So that's the other piece in terms of, you need to be able to provide a pathway where you have confidence around securing the regulatory approvals. And so that's a key part of what we're focused on now.
Amazing. And what are you looking to build in terms of a company and a culture then? Because going dual channel, you're probably going to go through a big significant phase of growth. It'd be good to understand what you want your company to look like from the outside.
I mean, I think the company, I don't expect it to change in terms of culture versus what it is now. I mean, we've been very clear on that from the start. It's a very collaborative environment. We have some very clear company values, and probably the two I'd call out are, one team that it's very much the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so that's very much how we would operate, not very, no hierarchical structure, and everyone needs to pitch in to do what's needed when it's needed. So that's one key piece. And then the other piece is continuous learning. And that's really important as a business, that we learn how to improve what we do, but also for individuals. I think that's probably the biggest single reason anyone joins a company like ours, is because they can probably learn more than they can learn in another role. And they usually earn those learnings where, they have to work hard and take on significant responsibility. But for the type of person where that's attractive, that's something we can offer that other people can't. I mean, we've had an individual who joined us when we were in the Trinity phase of the project, and he helped develop key parts of the device. He was there, he's probably been at most cases we've done. He was there in the room when we put it into the first patient. To kind of get to see that full journey, straight out of college is something that not every not every job opportunity can provide. I mean, it's he's certainly been a very significant contributor. So, and we've lots of individuals like that where they've stepped up and contributed, and then they get really significant kind of opportunities on the back of that. So that's what we would always see as very important for us to provide people in terms of, when we talk about the ecosystem here, I think you'd hope that, lots of individuals will learn about the startup journey in CroíValve and hopefully go on to found their own companies. And in 20 years' time, you can see maybe that footprint be far more significant than it is now. So yeah, that's a key part of, I mean, the team is the most important thing we have. That's definitely first and foremost. So you need to make sure that, you hire great people and then you give them great opportunity.
I love that you talked about retention there. It's one of the most important things. People forget that. They always want to talk about attraction. They forget about keeping really good people there. So I love that you mentioned that there. As you grow, attraction is a key part of that. What do you think makes CroíValve so attractive?
I mean, I think structural heart is a funny kind of area where it is one of the more challenging, types of devices in medical devices. You're putting a valve into a patient's heart. There's nowhere to hide in that. So it's typically more challenging from a technology perspective, but also potentially more rewarding. You have you have the ability to see a highly novel device go into a patient's heart and improve their trajectory. So I think for people who like a challenge, that is something that, that others can't offer. And you often see people who have worked in heart valves or in structural heart sort of come back to it again and again because, they get hooked on that kind of challenge and the level of innovation, which is maybe, not saying there isn't lots of innovation in other therapeutic areas, but structural heart has certainly had lots of opportunity of really unique devices doing things differently. So I think that's something we can provide. And for people who like that challenge, it's, and you're very much, front and center in terms of the patient treatment. We prep the device. We have team members in the room when the patients are treated. We screen the patient. So it's in terms of that proximity to kind of patient outcomes, I guess there's a very tight feedback loop there. So I suppose, that's possibly what we can offer. We try and be, as flexible as we can be in terms of geography. We have, as I say, we have kind of R&D and operations in Dublin and in Galway. So, there's times when people need to be physically present for those activities where we can't be, completely flexible, but certainly we try and be flexible. We've had people move to Canada and move to the UK and continue to work with us because we wanted them to. So, I think it's, but I think probably the biggest thing we offer people is that opportunity to really be at the forefront of developing a completely novel device and be very close to seeing that journey.
Amazing. And I love how you're passionate about the structural heart space. You clearly love that space. If you wasn't building CroíValve today, what companies do you think you'd be keeping a close eye on? Actually, I'm going to change that. Companies in Ireland, do you think you'd be keeping a close eye on?
I mean, I don't know whether I'm going to call out any companies. I think there's really great companies in Ireland, and I do keep a close eye on, all of the, sort of what I would see as all of our peers in terms of people who are going through the journey. I think anyone who goes through these journeys understands the journey, and sort of has the war stories to share behind the scenes of what maybe doesn't get posted on LinkedIn. And so I think because you often understand the hard work that's gone on, it's great to see the success. And I think, across lots of different therapeutic areas and different journeys, it's really great to see that, and I think the ecosystem here is maturing where historically you wouldn't have had a ton of companies that were, taking a device to commercial sales in the US, and that's happening quite frequently now, which is great to see, multiple examples of that. So I think there's lots of great companies to watch here, and I think it's really exciting to see, now the breadth of experience is going to be in terms of going through that full journey, and I can't wait to see, maybe hopefully what, if those businesses are successful and they get sold on, what the team will do next.
Amazing. And I wanted to zoom back in something that you mentioned before, is that you hope eventually people that have joined CroíValve will eventually go on and start their own businesses. What would you tell yourself if you was to have everything you know now in terms of knowledge and what you've done over the last 8 years, if you were to start again?
Great question. I remember being on a panel with somebody, with the co-founder, and we were sort of asked about what it takes to do this kind of journey, and our answer was, a low threshold for boredom and a reasonable level of naivety. So there is a piece of not fully knowing the journey. I mean, not that it hasn't been a great journey, but I think it's almost not a bad thing to only focus on what's next and not have to think about the whole journey and potentially all of the pitfalls. If you really focused on all of the things that could go wrong, you maybe never would get started. I mean, I think it comes back to, and this was said to me early on, fundamentally taking on something that you believe has a very strong value proposition. You can't really have something that's about a sort of nice marketing ploy that sounds good, that has some buzzwords, but is only slightly better than what's already there. I think the journey is too long and too challenging to try and make that successful. So I think you need to fundamentally make sure you get back to maybe why I did this, in terms of making sure you can get involved at the start and get the right foundations. You do need to interrogate your value proposition and make sure those kind of foundations of what you're trying to achieve and why you're better than what else is there really is real and matters, and it's not just that it sounds good on a slide, because that's what will be tested, and ultimately now in most medical device journeys you have to prove that you're not going to get bought without the evidence. So yeah, I think very much fundamentally believe in what you're trying to do.
Okay, amazing. And if we were sitting here in 5 years' time and everything's gone amazing, what do you want CroíValve to be known for?
I mean, ultimately for providing a good treatment option to patients, that's first and foremost what you'd like. Lots of medical devices don't get to ultimately become a sort of standard of care for patients. So, first and foremost, that's what you want. You want all the hard work to try and translate to something that can impact patients' lives. And then, you'd hope that you provided a return to your investors. They've trusted you with their capital. And so, the other piece is that, you've set a whole group of people up with a level of experience that they can then apply to the next challenge.
Amazing. And what would be your advice to anyone that's thinking about getting started in the cardiovascular space? And I don't just mean starting a business, even just joining the space right now. It seems like it's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of amazing companies. What do you want to tell people that should be looking at this space?
Good question. Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity in cardiovascular. It's often one of the better known spaces, I guess, in medical devices, so gets lots of airtime. Lots of positive factors in terms of maybe the ability to really impact patients. With that does come, the challenge side of things. You're putting a device into a patient's heart if it's it's cardiovascular. So you need to, that environment, the heart beats every heartbeat. And so you need to make sure that you can function within that environment. And then the stakes are high. If you get it wrong, that's a big impact as well. So I think if for people, if they like a challenge, there's lots of opportunity in terms of impact, and lots of great innovation. And as our population continues to age, it's obviously a disease that continues to grow in terms of the number of people impacted by it. So it's certainly not a diminishing area of interest. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you very much for joining us today. I think I've got absolutely tons of information out of you. And I truly hope you guys make it. You've got some incredible technology. I love the stories, the whys, and the reason you started the business. So I hope you go all the way.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the Crux of Cardio. If there's one thing this space has taught me, both personally and professionally, it's that progress in cardiovascular care is never the result of one individual. It's built by ecosystems, by teams, by people willing to take the long bets on hard problems. At Crux, our mission is to support that ecosystem through talent, capital and community. The podcast is one small part of that effort, a place to share the real stories from people shaping the future of cardiovascular care. If you found value in today's conversation, I would love for you to follow the show and share it with someone building in this space. And if you're a founder, operator or investor working on something meaningful in the cardiovascular care space, we'd love to hear from you.